everybody. So we're going to be here for the rest of the week. We have a distinguished guest over here, Daphne Clifford of Oxford University and formerly of SOAS is sitting in with us today, a scholar who's interested in what we're doing. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you Professor Rabi. As many of you know, Uzi is the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle East and African Affairs of Tel Aviv University. And he was a former chair of the Department of Middle East Studies and African History at Tel Aviv University. He specializes in areas which include oil and politics in the Middle East, Iranian-Arab relations, and Sunni-Shiite tensions. Professor Rabi is the author of many publications, academic articles, and books. His most recent publications are the edited volumes entitled International Intervention in Local Conflicts and the Yemen Revolution, Civil War, and Unification. His forthcoming book project is States and Religion in the Era of Revolution, the Changing Face of the 21st Century in the Middle East. Uzi is a senior researcher at the Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University, and he's regularly invited to speak at the Knesset to deliver updates and briefings on the developments in the Middle East. I think his work is very important. As a footnote, I had the honor of being a visiting professor this past year at the Dayan Center, thanks to Uzi. But I think in a sense what we're trying to do, which is very important, in very general terms, I think the study of anti-Semitism has been largely focused on European history and the Holocaust in general. There's exceptions, but that's generally what's going on. I think Middle East studies has sort of, in general, has had a blind spot for all sorts of reasons that we've discussed in terms of Said and the sort of the focus of Orientalism after the debates of, I think, Professor Bernard Lewis and Said. There's been a big shift in Middle East studies and maybe even in the academy. But people studying the Middle East who are experts on religion and they speak the languages, they know the cultures, they've often never really engaged the study of anti-Semitism. So I think that there's a real need for people studying the Middle East and the rapidly changing region, that's what you'll hear from Uzi, and to understand how anti-Semitism has played a role in the ideologies that are certainly influential in the region. And yet at the same time, we as scholars of anti-Semitism don't really understand the ideology, the religion, the language, and what's taking place on the ground in a very important part of the world. And there's not many better people in the world that can sort of shed light on what's happening on the ground and its implications. So we're honored you're here. Thank you.
Oh, thanks a lot, Charles. I mean, good morning, everybody. It is a real pleasure to be here and to share with you some of the insights we do have in our research and teaching agendas about our ever-changing region. Basically, you know, the diagnosis is pretty clear, and maybe we should take it also into or to some other walks of research like anti-Semitism and etc. What's going on in the Middle East actually calls into question many of the conventions we used in the 20th century. What I'm going to do today is, since we have two sessions, today and tomorrow, I would do that. My book is really forthcoming in 2 weeks' time. It deals with the Middle East in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. It is comprised of 5 chapters. So here is the deal. 4 chapters, I'm going to deal with that today, and then we'll have the Q&A. And the 5th, which is Israel and the Middle East. Israel and the Arab world, Israel and Islam, Jews and Islam. This is something which we're going to deal with tomorrow. So I'll confine myself to those 5 themes that are part and parcel of my would-be book. It has to do with a very, very simple diagnosis. Things have changed in the Middle East so dramatically that we cannot, definitely not, use the conventions we had used in the 20th century in order to analyze the circumstances, geopolitically speaking, economically speaking, culturally speaking, in the Middle East. So basically what we are doing, or trying to do in my center, the Dayan Center in Tel Aviv University, in all walks of research, is to set the stage for what we call the 21st century and make sure that things are not going to be measured by notions and layers of the 20th century realities. It has to do with nationalism, it has to do with religious, it has to do with democracy, I guess it has to do with anti-Semitism, etc. We have some new tools by which to better analyze things, but the most important thing we have actually to take into account is that in the Middle East things were dramatically changed, and we have to just ask ourselves, before getting to the solution or jumping into the conclusion that there is a solution, as everybody does, what we are trying actually to make sure first is that we know what the problems are first, and then trying to deal with them in kind of a more elaborated way, which is based on tools, devices, notions, insights that are coming from our fresh research agenda. So let me start with the first thing that should be reckoned with. This would be what we call political culture. You know, in the 20th century, people held a very simplistic agenda while dealing with the Arab world. Because each Arab state has its own one-man or iron-fisted dictator by which to understand the state. So, for example, while dealing with Libya, you were focusing at Gaddafi, his entourage, the tribes that surrounded him, literally actually called Qaddafi, named after Gaddafi. And basically we were focusing at the apex of the pyramid. It was the ruler, his security forces or allied forces, and his extended family, of course, Hamullah. So, for example, when you look at, even roughly, scholarly literature of the 20th century, you would find titles like that. Libya under Gaddafi. Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Syria under Hafiz al-Assad or al-Assad family. So that was kind of goes without saying. The state is to be epitomized to kind of a one-man show. So you didn't deal with the society at large. What you knew for sure is that while trying to do or to understand the political mechanism of a certain state, you had to focus on the one at the top. So Iraq for many was Majmu'at Tikrit. What is Majmu'at Tikrit? It's the Tikrit mall. Tikrit is the town where actually Saddam Hussein was originated from. The Kardakha gang. Kardakha is the village where the Assad family actually was originated. So this was kind of a thing or an item by which to epitomize Syria, Iraq, etc. To make a long story short, what happened in the Arab Spring first of all has to do with the psychological motive. Barriers of fear collapsed. So, if to put it in kind of a holistic way, or a generalistic way, we should say that somebody has done, or let us say our research agenda should be conducted in line with not only top-down analysis that we did in the 20th century, but to a large extent bottom-up analysis. Bottom-up analysis. So, if that is the case, we cannot stick to what the leader said as the A and Z, as was the case in the 20th century. We have to carefully listen to the voices coming from within. We have to make sure we know who is who, especially when it comes to a multi-ethnic and multi-religious society like Iraq, Syria, etc. And we have to be equipped with the tools through which we're going to have an accessibility to the notions, the thoughts, and the new things that do characterize the nowadays society. Fortunately, what we have in the 21st century is kind of a tool that wasn't there in the 20th century. It's Facebook, Twitter. So just try to imagine that in Tel Aviv University in Israel, you're going to have young people aged 20-something who are Facebooking, Twittering in Kurdish, Farsi, Arabic, and Turkish. Just try to imagine what a very, very interesting and fascinating world it would be when it comes to our research agenda. And this is not the only tool we have to be equipped with. But if we are going to do the bottom-up analysis, we do listen to the youngsters or the young generation. We do listen to many, many groups who are coming to the fore in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, denouncing their rulers, trying to create kind of a new reality, a new state, a new society. And they could be radicals, Islamists, just young people who would like to have a state where there are better job opportunities, and so on and so forth. But the power is definitely to be found on the ground, not necessarily at the apex of the pyramid. So the whole equation of ruler-ruled relationships, for better, for worse, has dramatically changed. There is no way back to status quo ante. No way back. So this is something we have to take as kind of a pillar while climbing through the 21st century. It has to do with a real change in the political culture. And I'm pretty sure that if we would like actually to better understand the Middle East, maybe the Middle East with the West, or the let us say, related, or let us say the connections the Middle East is having with the West in all walks of life, this is definitely actually the tool we have to be equipped with. So here is one main thing that we have to bear in mind. The whole research table should be changed in terms of tools, in terms of channels of thought, in terms of conclusions. We are just in the beginning. There's a lot to do there, but things were changed in kind of a way that makes us say to ourselves, the one who is still using 20th century conventions could lag behind. If we would like actually to be in tandem with time, we have to be equipped with a more fresh agenda when it comes to the political culture. Second is very, very interesting because, paradoxically speaking, the era of the Arab Spring in the Middle East was to herald the coming to the fore of democracy. What we had instead of that is kind of an era that emphasized the instrumentality or the greater instrumentality of religion in that part of the world, the Middle East. So out of the Middle East, people were pretty confident that it could be only much better than it was, while toppling iron-fisted dictators. Instead of that, what we got here is kind of a situation where religion, coming from times immemorial, is being revived in a way that is very, very pretentious. Religion is trying to dictate the rhythm, and religion denies, actually, the prevailing circumstances which is consisted of states and societies. So if you get it, we are talking about kind of a paradox in the 21st century. In that part of the region, the past is attacking the present. While many thought that the Middle East is heralding a new age, the Arab Spring is heralding a new age. And it was very, very fit to Western agenda. Because the Arab Spring was taken by the West, by the world, as kind of an indication that the Middle East also has reached the corridor which leads to democracy. So the Arab Spring actually got this title or name after many revolutions in the West. In the mid-19th century, in post-USSR revolutions, it was taken as kind of a progress. And remember, when you look at Western history, generally speaking, religion is being considered as something which is very anachronistic, sort of a passé. What is the French Revolution? The Industrial Revolution? Other revolutions that Europe has experienced throughout the ages, the recent centuries, if not kind of a way by which to further marginalize religion. So religion was, in Europe, kind of a thing that was left for the individual to decide. It was a thing which was related more and more to the individual sphere. The notion was pretty clear. State and societies are not going to be formed in line with religion. Religion cannot be a pillar which is going to dictate the build-up of state and societies in the West. In our region, religion is so instrumental that let me jump into kind of a conclusion. The state or the society which is not going to get kind of a compromise among itself when it comes to religion and other cultures is doomed. Take, for example, Egypt. The incumbent is Abdel Fattah al-Sisi. He ousted Mohammed Morsi, a guy from the Muslim province. Where is the bone of contention? Sisi and Morsi. An unprofessional eye would say that this is just a struggle for power in materialistic terms. But it is not true. These guys do hold two different visions as to what Egypt should look like in the future. Morsi vied for sort of an Islamic republic. What he tried to do is to Islamize Egypt. Sisi would like to have Egypt with a more secular flavor, respecting religion, but not letting religion to be the ANC. Hamas versus Fatah, a bloody struggle. Both are Palestinians. So where the bone of contention is? Both of them would like to have Palestine, that's true. But why do they kill each other? Why do they become enemies, competing each other? What is the bone of contention? If and when there is Palestine, what sort of Palestine I would like to have? An Islamic Palestine or a secular Palestine? Now, this is not a theory to be implemented on the scholarly literature. This is kind of a problem which is very bloody, alive and kicking. And the one who is familiar with Ramallah or some other part of the West Bank would definitely say that this is becoming something which is very, very acute for the Palestinian future. So don't look at this as if we are talking about an academic problem or academic discussion. As I found many Westerners actually do that. They think that, well, never mind, because they are Palestinians, they gonna find kind of a middle course at a certain stage. Don't worry. Well, I'm not worried about that. But if I would be a Palestinian, I would be very worried about that. Why? Because Palestinians were to go through the tunnel where there is no light in the end of which. This is a very bloody struggle that could be solved out only and only if there is kind of a compromise to be achieved between religion and other cultures of the same society. Turkey. We've just seen kind of a drama which is going in Turkey. So what the bone of contention here is, Erdogan would like to smash the agenda. New Turkey was built up on. 90 years ago, a guy named Mustafa Kemal Atatürk orchestrated a new state in the Middle East named Turkey. And his agenda was not only actually marginalize Islam, to outlaw Islam. Atatürk outlawed Islam. What he had in mind is a very secular state, which is heading toward the West, leaving behind the East, giving up on the one-time remnants of the Ottoman Empire. Turkism. Now, what Erdogan has been done with his AKP party for more than a decade now is to gradually demolish the ingredients of Atatürk's agenda. And you have seen that in the failed coup d'etat in Turkey in the recent month. Now, it is true that he had kind of a very fierce oppositioner named Fethullah Gülen, which I guess you heard of. But this is only one part of the Islamic camp which can be found in Turkey. The basic and the main notion here is secularism versus Islamism. And having said that, this is just a story of a certain state. How about the coming to the fore of the monster, ISIS? And ISIS is saying loud and clear that the notion of nation state is not valid anymore, should not be. So they are not dealing with a certain order to be implemented in a certain state. They don't accept the notion of state. Because the more patriotic and nationalistic you are, the less religious you are. It's a simple zero-sum game. Nationalism and religion in our part of the world, in that part of the world, well, this is basically an anathema. Religion contradicts nationalism. And this is why ISIS was to be given birth when states in this region were crushed in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. So think about the instrumentality of religion. This notion, very, very Western, of separation between state and church. Well, this is the exact recipe for a disaster to every Middle Eastern society. So this should be actually excluded from our agenda. This is a very Western thinking which cannot be implemented when it comes to Middle Eastern societies. And I would say that it has to do with Africa, of course. The notion is how to build up a bridge, or how to bridge the gap not separation. Separation is the recipe for an ongoing disaster. Try to keep that in mind, because while entering to the Middle Eastern field, one should ask himself what the religious component is being comprised of. And if you actually go and just double check Western Europe, maybe other parts of the world, take into account that Muslims, to a large extent, are being tempted viciously to reconsider their identity circles. And this is becoming kind of a bon ton of the 21st century, everywhere. It started with the Middle East, but it is to be found all over the world now. The third theme that I would like to further emphasize is the one that I find fascinating. I wrote a book about Yemen, and now in the new book, I actually dedicated a chapter to that. This is what we call the failed states, or collapsing state. It is so common a notion, it became so common a notion in the scholarly literature, that even the Arab literature is talking a lot about what they call dawla fashila, which is the synonym to failed state. So what is this notion? Theoretically speaking, we know that there are some states, and we have seen that in the Balkans and in some other parts of the world, when states or the regime is not able to exert full influence over the whole territory, what we're going to see is kind of a process of dismemberment or fragmentation. So when the center is not that powerful, what we're going to see is enclaves or latifundians growing up and having kind of an independent course for themselves at the expense of the state. So basically this is a very mechanical process that could be seen and found in some other parts of the world. The problem is that in the Middle East, it has to do with one-time identities that are coming to the fore. So the break-on is not being done or conducted mechanically. It is in line and in accordance with identities coming from times immemorial, challenging the very new order and creating a totally different chessboard that should be read differently and should be referred to in a different vocabulary. Now look at this map. This is the map you know as the map of the Middle East. Well, this is a misleading map. This is, for me, the map of the 20th century. Some of the states here do not exist. But because it is much more convenient to the UN and the world to mention Iraq and to stick to Syria, people have in mind the same notions we used to have in the 20th century. People talk about Iraq and Syria as if they are there, as was the case in the 20th century. There are no such things. It is something which is totally different. Now, what do we have there? let's start with the story of, let me give you kind of an example. Let's see what we have here. Okay, let's take this thing. This is Iraq. Iraq was created in 1921 by the British. You know that with the downfall of the Ottoman Empire, British, French, and Russians, the architects of the Sykes-Picot Agreement were to forge or orchestrate a totally different and new Middle East. Iraq was under British control because the British found it very, very important to safeguard the waterway in the Persian Gulf going down to India, their jewel in the crown. So what the British did is just to gather 3 one-time provinces of the Ottoman Empire. In Ottoman Turkish it is called vilayet, or vilayet, provinces, eyalet or vilayet. Shiites, Basra, Mosul, in the Kurds, and of course the Sunni part. Just to make a long story short, what the British had in mind is to create a new nation state. They actually orchestrated the whole thing in line with their layers in order to preserve their imperial interests. The same goes for France in Syria and Lebanon. And that was the byproduct, Iraq. An amalgam of Sunnis and Shiites. Huge animosity coming from the very early dawn of Islam. And Arabs and Kurds, 2 different peoples. Kurds are having their own language, history, and they are people by themselves, like the Turks, Persians, Arabs, Kurds, different people. When I was in Kew gathering some material for my PhD, that was a long time ago, one of the correspondence that I was very, very excited to come through was that of a correspondence between the Foreign Office in London and the political resident in Iraq, Sir Arnold Woodson, political agent, sorry. And what was asked there, in kind of a very, very fascinating way, by one of the clerks of the Foreign Office, he just sent a telegram to Baghdad, February 1921, a month before the creation of Iraq. And that could be summed up in the words, what if? What if Sunnis would go for Shiites, Arabs for Kurds? I was so eager to have the response coming from Baghdad. And so Arnold Woodson said loud and clear, thank you for the note, but that won't happen here. Because what we are going to do is to teach them to let bygone be bygone. Just like that. We're gonna engineer their memory. That was the notion of the nation state in the Middle East. All of them were to become Iraqis, leaving behind their primordial identity. The same goes for Syria, if you look at this. That's the same notion. French mandate. So what you got here is Lebanon, which was cut off from the beginning, Syria. And this is why Syria had kind of an irredenta claim from Lebanon throughout the 20th century. You have here Alawites, Druze, Kurds, Sunnis, Christians, and some Shiites. A plethora of orientations, of tastes. It was to become Syria. And throughout the 20th century, nobody spoke here because it was very dangerous to say something which goes against the logic that the Assad family put forth. Syria and Iraq, no states. And what we got is a bunch of mini-states, not formal states, of course, because the UN would stick to Iraq and Syria. Otherwise, they would get a lot of problems with states like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran. So everybody speaks the language of the 20th century and use that in order to understand 21st century realities. So this is the exact recipe for a grave mistake. Now, if we are going to gather Syria and Iraq, and neighboring states, of course, this is what we're going to get. Well, the map is not a static map because every day we get something else there. But basically, let me show you that maybe. Here you go. Syria and Iraq together. So let's name the areas of this map in line or in accordance with what I said. So my chapter in my would-be book speaks about the alternative map, how to read the map in a different manner. This for me is Kurdistan. I don't know if you happen to be there, but the one who goes there would definitely say that Kurdish is the language which is being spoken. In Suleymaniya and Erbil, actually, you have Kurdish market. You have Peshmerga, which is the Kurdish army. So it's Kurdish for all means and purposes except UN recognition. And you know why. We'll talk about the West later on. But you know why. You don't know why. We'll talk later on about that. But the most important thing is that if you look at this map, you have here Shiistan, which is being stretched from Baghdad to Basra. This is the Iraqi government that came to be legitimate here after the 2003 removal of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Shiistan, Kurdistan, this is also Kurdistan, but the Kurdistan of one-time Syria. The Kurds have their own vocabulary. This is Rojava, this is Roj Halat, Bashur, and Bakur. This is one-time Kurdistan. West, east, north, south. So just to let you have an idea about it. One time there was Kurdistan. It was not a state. It was a land named Kurdistan. Sykes-Picot Agreement served to make those Kurds Iraqis, those Kurds Syrians, those Kurds Turks, and those Kurds Iranians. But Kurds are mainly Kurds. That's the end game. So in this part we have Alawites. This is where Bashar al-Assad is with his Alawite sect, supported by the Iranians and the Russians. This is for me Alawistan. Alawistan. Don't come up with that actually as a form, because nobody would understand that. But Alawistan is the land of the Alawites. I won't dare call that Druzistan, because Druze do not like to have a state of their own. They would like to get kind of a middle course with the incumbent in every state where they are. But they have here a problem because what happened in Syria. And what is the gray shadow in both Iraq and Syria? Now, this is ISIS in full flower. Okay, now what ISIS is saying, and let me just be very, very clear and short about that. ISIS has celebrated not the occupation of land and territories after the American withdrawal from the Middle East. ISIS has celebrated the notion which is called in Arabic Kasr al-Hudud, breaking up the borders. So staying here and smashing this border means that what you have here is kind of breaking up the boundaries of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, which were to divide Muslims into Iraqis, Syrians, whatever. Nation state was taken by ISIS, as was the case with Al-Qaeda and others. But this time we had kind of a new state in the stead of that. It is called Caliphate, in accordance with the notion of Prophet Muhammad and the first Islamic state. And basically what you got here is kind of a state which identifies people in accordance with their religion, not with their nationalistic type. And if to go to the extreme or to the end of this argument, nationalism or a bunch of nation states that were seen here in the Middle East was not more than a Western conspiracy by which to practice the art of divide and rule among Muslims. This is not just a simple theoretical argument. This is what I said before. The past is attacking the present. You would like to have a state? No problem. But there is only one state. No Palestine. No Syria. No Iraq. This is not acceptable. The only state should be an Islamic polity. which calls upon Muslims all over the world to be on board.
And sold them to non-Muslims. They sold them to Russia.
Sorry?
And sold them to non-Muslims.
Yeah, sure, sure. But the basic thing is to identify people in accordance with their own religious time. If somebody is coming up with the notion of you are Lebanese, you are Syrian, you are French, you are Swedish, you are Russian, you are whatever, this is a Western thinking. Nationalism is an anathema when it comes to religion in the eyes of Allah. So now, how are we going to deal with this Middle East? If we're going to stick to the notions of nation states, we haven't got a clue about the configuration or about the power configurations in this region. So first of all, we have to be equipped with a new, maybe old, but new, in comparison to the 20th century, socio-demographic vocabulary. Kurds, Druze, Sunnis, Shiites, Alawites, Azeris, Baluchis. What is that? This is not the language being spoken in the West. Give me states, because this is the only way I think people should live with. I'm not saying that all Westerners do think that, but this is the overall thinking. People should be confined to nation states. This is how the international community identifies people, even if they are refugees. They have to be identified from the where, or from the place or the state they were originated from. A new vocabulary. And here's the thing. The one-time identities, regional, tribalistic in nature, religious, familial, are much more resilient than the modern identities, nationalistic ones. That is the end game in the Middle East. This is what was proved in the years after the Arab Spring, in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. Paradoxically speaking, people are much more connected to their primordial identity. So let me put it in kind of a very, very simplistic way maybe, but this is what I would argue. The Druze is much more Druzier than ever before. The Kurd is much more Kurdish than ever before. People are sticking to their one-time primordial identity. And if they are doing that, they make the other who didn't think about that to start doing the same, even undeliberately. So this is actually the trick here. We are climbing to the 21st century instead of getting what we call global village, compact village, where everybody speaks the same language and we do have the same experience. What we got is the opposite. Plethora of identities coming to the fore, denouncing the modern identities, and trying to build up a very meticulous and well-planned narrative that says that they are the chosen one. So if you think that you could bring the Kurds back to Iraq or Syria, well, let me tell you that this is a pie in the sky. No way. Of course, Obama and Hollande and others would talk about the reintegration of Iraq, the reintegration of Syria. This is a pie in the sky. Lip service. You can't deal with these primordial identities unless you recognize them. So if you would like to have kind of a formula by which to start solving our problem, you should not get into the Middle East with the one-time identities of the of the 20th century, Iraq, Syria, etc. But you should be equipped with a new socio-demographic vocabulary, which recognizes the multiculturalistic and multi-religious plethora, and make people respect the otherness of the other. Make people respect the otherness of the other. What we have in the Middle East now is that either me or you. It's not a matter of respecting the others of the other, it's just either me or you. So we have to come up with kind of a real, huge educational revolution in order to grow, or to make actually next generations be grown up in accordance with a totally different agenda. But until then, if we are trying actually to come up with kind of an analysis of what we have here, this is the situation. No Syria, no Iraq. Maybe I should just show you another state that is. Look at this. Libya. That was a very strong state. You know what is strong? Strong because there was just one and only, and nobody talked. Silence. And we thought that this is a very strong state. It was not strong, it was very weak. Because the only means with which the ruler will enforce himself on the people is just power. So what do you think happened with Libya? I have to say, though, sorry for that, I don't want to get you confused, but when I say actually Druze, Alawites, Kurds, etc., Shiites, just take into account that what came to the fore, and the Arab Spring was to catalyze that. This is kind of a process that started in 1979 with the Islamic Revolution in Iran. It is the schism and the big conflict between Sunnis and Shiites, of course, from the early dawn of Islam. So basically, on top of these lacunas and latifundias of ethnies, Kurds, Alawites, etc., we have a major rift here that tears up the region. It is the Sunni versus Shia, of course. And to make a long story short, it started in 1979, was to catalyze in April 2003 with the ousting of Saddam Hussein, which was Sunni, and the coming to the fore of the Shiites, and of course was to be seen here in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. So, any Shiites in the grey spot? What do you think? Considering that ISIS is a very Puritan Sunni,
Only dead Shiites.
dead or out? Yeah, no Shiites. And this is of no surprise that ISIS was to be accepted in these regions because these regions were inhabited by mainly Sunnis who'd rather have ISIS, very radical though, but they'd rather have him when it comes to comparison to the Shiites in Baghdad or the Alawites in Damascus. Both of them should be taken as Shiites. So people are moving because they cannot stay in a place where the incumbent is a rival of their sect. So Shiites are going to move west or east, because this is Shiites and this is Alawites, which is sort of Shiites, and Lebanon, of course, is being ruled by Hezbollah, which is a client of Iran, which is the master of Shiism. And the Middle East, when it deals with, when it comes to powerful hegemony in this region. Sunnis versus Shiites. Huge animosity. Huge animosity. Saudi Arabia versus Iran. Gulf states versus Iran. Hezbollah, the client of Iran, which is being considered by them as a Trojan horse, which is trying actually to turn the Middle East into an Iranian fiefdom. And of course, it's not geopolitics. Geopolitics is what we should see in our eyes, the unprofessional eyes which see, definitely. But try to imagine that each saying that I'm coming up with here is being corroborated by a very long narrative which goes down to times immemorial. So what Iran is doing is just another indication of what we thought and knew about how dangerous Shiites could be, and vice versa, of course. So the well of animosities from the early dawn of history in this region is being brought in kind of a way which is very, very problematic. So here is the thing: if you don't know how people memorize themselves, if you are familiar, if you are not familiar with the narratives of history in this region, you cannot analyze the present. And this is the simplest equation. If you don't know the language, if you don't know actually the pieces, the bits and pieces, if you don't know how people memorize themselves, what they think about themselves in historical terms, you are doomed. What are you going to do? So if you ask me actually what we are doing with our students, what we are doing with trying to do with our next generations of researchers, students, etc. in Israel and even with the world, what we can do is just to make people be stripped of their own culture while dealing with the other culture. Just simple as that. That is very difficult, by the way. It sounds very simple, but it's very, very difficult. Now, how are we going to do that? Language, history, and make people be able to imagine what the guy on the other side of the road has in mind when it comes to things that, for me, are pretty clear. And you would find that it is more often than not the opposite when it comes to the other side. So make sure that you have that in mind, because this is the era of fragmentation in the Middle East, and it is not just a fragmentation that would cause people to reconsider their identity. Is a humanitarian crisis. We have here more than 500,000 people being slaughtered, most of them Muslims, that were slaughtered by Muslims. Muslims by Muslims. $15 million refugees and displaced. Can you internalize this number? And it goes on and on, by the way. On and on. Because nobody in this world has a clue of what to do with that. The international forces are using slogans in order to pay lip service to them. Nobody really knows how to solve out the problem. You know why? It is insolvable. At least for the time being. Insolvable. So this is a real mess. The search for identities, refugees fighting for their life. We've been to Jordan actually 2 weeks ago. I've been to Al-Za'atari refugee camp in Jordan. Wow. A real misery. A real misery. I don't know how even to express that in words. That is something which is a real disaster. Take, for example, Libya. Sorry, where's Libya? Well, Libya is no Sunnis and Shiites. Just almost 400 clans, tribal clans. So you can think of that. With the breakup, every confederation, tribal confederation, is trying to make the most of it. Some of them just actually took control over pipelines of oil, harbors, in order to make sure that they are going to be left with kind of a slice of money and influence. In accordance with history, Libya was to be divided into 3 one-time provinces. Cyrenaica, with Benghazi as the capital city, Tripolitania, with Tripoli, and Fezzan. Now think of that. Here, the imperator was Italy. It is not part of the Sykes-Picot concoction. Let me just use the ISIS language. Here, Italy was the orchestrator. But basically, the state, which was very artificial from the beginning, and was held thanks to the iron-fisted dictator. With the toppling of the iron-fisted dictator, what we got is those 3 provinces, each one of them declaring independence. Now, they would like to get back to Libya, but only if their province is the leading one. Now, Tripoli and Cyrenaica are having acrimonious relations for ages. It's a matter of culture, narratives. And don't be surprised that the Arab Spring, actually, which was to hit Gaddafi in nearby Tripoli, was to start from Benghazi. The same goes for Bashar al-Assad. The Arab Spring didn't start in Damascus. When his people actually are situated, but in Daraa, in the north of Syria, where his rivals are. Think of that. You won't be able to move in this Middle East unless you are going to develop kind of a fresh agenda which has to do not only with the geopolitics of the region, but with the cultural differences and attributes that should be reckoned with. Let's move to the fourth and last thing. Okay with that? Yeah. So the fourth would be what I call the West and the Middle East. This is also kind of a byproduct of the Arab Spring. There is a break here when it comes to the interrelationship between the West and the Middle East. I would dare say that this is the first time after 200 years where we don't have in the Middle East a sky which is being wrapped up with patterns and international layers. So in the recent 2 centuries, it went without saying, the Middle East is being run one way or the other by international geopolitics. So, for example, Russia versus, USSR versus the US, Cold War. We have seen the Cold War being brought into the Middle East, and we have a pro-USSR and pro-US states who were fighting each other because they have pattern from the outside. Not to mention 100 years ago the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Western attempt to create a new Middle East, which is built up on what we call nation states. Think of that. The West was part and parcel of the history of this region. So if somebody's going to say no troops on the ground, and I can accept that if I would be an American. If somebody is going actually to exclude himself, one shot from this region, this would be very traumatic for some states which were heavily dependent on the US. For example, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Morocco, Persian Gulf states, the monarchies, I mean. Why? Because in the 20th century, it was clear-cut. If you're going to have a problem that would damage your politics or survival, you're going to have, in the end of the day, the patron is going to rescue you. Well, the precedent that was set in Egypt with Mubarak in the United States, the voices from Washington saying that Mubarak should go, put an end to that kind of an axiom. An end. So now even if the Americans are going to promise, and they won't, but even if they are, nobody would count on that. So what I'm trying to tell you here is that we do have states and players in the region which feel as if they were left alone. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. This is what they have in mind. So if you think and you ask yourself why Saudi Arabia is going into Yemen or into Bahrain, they are going there in order to block the Iranian activity there. And since they do not count on the United States because the United States had this deal with Iran, they are going to take their destiny into their hands. This is a very combustible Middle East. combustibility, since I can't count on nobody, and since there are no camps anymore, we have a huge field of bits and pieces, and what we got here is kind of a situation where everything should be remeasured. No camps. What you have here is a strict patron-client relation, very, very cynical, which has to do with the politics of survival of a certain sect and preserving the interest of a superpower or regional power. So Russia is supporting Bashar al-Assad. Why?
His base, Soviets always had a base.
Okay, Soviets always have a base in Latakia and Tartus. Oh, it's not that, sorry. Just the name. Latakia and Tartus, the Syrian coast. But, here is the thing, if somebody is going actually to give me a hard time on Ukraine, for example, I'm going to use the Middle Eastern card and give him hell. Okay? United States is no boots on the ground, which is a lie, of course, because we have almost 70,000 Americans in the region already, and they are trying to combat against ISIS or whatever. But they do support the Kurds. They cannot support the Kurds in terms of independence, because this was raised the ire of both Turkey and Iran, because they have their own Kurds, and their own Kurds might actually aspire for their own autonomy or their own independence. But you support the Kurds because they are anti-Bashar and they are anti-ISIS. Iran is supporting Hezbollah. Iran is having huge dreams of building up an empire in the region and having sort of a stronghold in the other part of the region. Now, commanders of the Pasdaran, of the Revolutionary Guards, are to be found in the eastern coast of the Mediterranean. Everybody knows that. Turks, and everyone is playing a double standard game, but Turks are supporting the rebels in Syria with the hope that they would serve as counterbalance to the Kurds, because the Kurds are rivals of the Turks. Turks are anti-Iranians, anti-Bashar, and Turks are anti-ISIS. So the fact that ISIS is the rival of everybody is not enough. Because everybody, the everybody's, have a top ISIS of ISIS, another set of rivalries with others. So if you get the idea here, it's sort of a bazaar, kind of a Middle Eastern market. Nobody could forge a strategy. What we have is a bunch of tactics, day by day. And what you're going to have here is kind of a way by which to minimize the scope of dangers which is being posed against you by doing some ad hoc alliances with players all over the region. Of course, the West has to start dealing with some other problems, because the guy who ran the show for the West is not here anymore. His name was Gaddafi. He was selling oil to Western Europe or to European states, and was in kind of a constant contact with Italy. France, and Spain. So look at this Middle East. Now we are moving to Africa. Think of Libya as the gate to Europe, to Southern Europe. And on the other side of the sea, you have Spain, Italy, France, states who are becoming destinations of many refugees coming from Africa up. And when Gaddafi was in power, he ran the show. He got sort of a deal with the European countries about a quota to be shifted to Europe. Now, it is sort of a failed state, no state order, and a bunch of refugees are trying to have their foothold on the other side of the sea in order to get some better life or to have kind of a politics of survival being actually better handled. It goes on and on. This is only the tip of Africa. You have here Chad and Niger, yeah, like Africa there. I mean, it's kind of a huge stream of people going there. So Europe has to deal with refugees. Now, in the 20th century, it went without saying. Neoliberalism. People should come. We should accept them. Maybe we're gonna have some difficulties with the immigrant himself. But that won't happen with his son or grandson, because they are going to become French citizens, Italian citizens. In a way, you can speak about that, but I would rather speak about primordial identities. Somebody actually is sending viruses through the internet, the Facebook, the virtual media, and make those grandsons, fourth generation or third generation of the one-time immigrants, think of themselves not as citizens of a European state. And they take their state as public enemy number one. And they would rather hit the state because they blame the state as the culprit behind their misery. So what makes actually people think that way? That's a long story, of course. We're trying to make sure that even if ISIS is being got rid, and you know that ISIS is being fought against these days, and everybody is preparing himself for the huge fight in Mosul and Raqqa, in Syria and Iraq. But are we going to understand ISIS only by territorial definitions? Or maybe we should got ISIS as kind of a phenomenon of radical Islam which is being brought up with 20th century tools, which means Facebooking, Twittering is kind of a tool by which to fight the West in a very useful way. This is an ongoing understanding that you cannot fight the West while dealing with airplanes and tanks. ISIS hasn't got even one single airplane. One single airplane. We have that. Sorry for that. These are different chapters. This is ISIS flag, of course. La ilaha illallah, and then actually Muhammad Rasulullah, Sayyidina Allah Rasul Muhammad, which is Muhammad is the Prophet of Allah. But what I wanted to show you is this. See that this is kind of a website or kind of a page of ISIS. Half of jihad is media. Lingua franca of ISIS is English, not Arabic. Also Russian, French, Spanish. So here's the thing. In order to fight the West, well, we have to be equipped, that's what ISIS is, with kind of a well-planned agenda that would make Muslims all over the place be aware of their Islam or being Muslim, thereby recognizing themselves as others. Of course, most Muslims do not have actually in mind that kind of an atrocity. But here's the thing. When somebody in Antwerp, Molenbeek, Marseille, Paris, whatever, is having kind of a crisis with himself, psychologically speaking, economically speaking, whatever, what these people are doing is just drop up his predicament with a very nice envelope, which is full of Islamic motives, and would make his predicament be explained in a much more deep and inter-civilizational way. Me versus the others. This is why I am deprived of almost everything. So think of that way. You would find that in Europe, the virus is already there. And some communities are thinking of themselves in terms of primordial identity. Now, they make the others think of themselves the same way. Because in Dortmund we have right-wing fascists coming to the fore against Angela Merkel, accusing her of opening up the gates of Germany. So it could cut either ways, don't forget that. It could cut either ways. So once we are starting with the language of me and the other, and if we don't have any control of that, and we don't have, because we don't have a counter-narrative, we don't have a counter-educational system, we're going to get a guy like Donald Trump, who is going actually to capitalize on the Hispanic issue, black and white. So Trump is not kind of a problem. Trump is a symptom of a problem that could be actually cleaned from the American society. ISIS is not as bad a problem. I'm not saying that Trump is ISIS. I'm just trying to say that when societies are being fragmented that way, there should be kind of a different agenda to come to the fore to make people be recipient of such notions. Oh yeah, stop here.
On that note, we're going to go to the tradition of English cultural tea. Imported from colonial Africa. Enjoy. Enjoy. Thank you. We'll be back at 11:30.